Bien, donc, comme je l'ai dit précédemment, nous allons donc passer.
Fine. As I was saying, we will now turn our attention to item 4 of the agenda, given that resolutions 33 and so on will be taken up later on. That is to say, those that we have not dealt with under item 3. Therefore, we will turn our attention to item 4, which brings the Council to the examination of document A, HCR 26/L4/Rev1, entitled "The Continuing Grave Deterioration in the Human Rights and Humanitarian Situation in the Syrian Arab Republic." The main sponsor of this draft is the United Kingdom, and Saudi Arabia will also be introducing this draft. I give the floor, to start with, to the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. President. The United Kingdom has the honour to present this resolution on the human rights situation in Syria on behalf of a group of main sponsors: France, Germany, Italy, Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, UK and United States, and we are joined by over 50 co-sponsors. We have made one oral revision to OP 13. This is in order to update the text and to reflect the announcement made by the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons on the removal of chemical weapons from Syria. This oral revision has been circulated in the room. Mr. President, it's with deep sadness that we present yet another resolution on Syria at this Human Rights Council. The crisis in Syria continues to have a devastating impact on civilians. Men, women and children are being denied their fundamental freedoms and the ability to exercise their human rights day after day. Once again, this Council cannot remain silent but must respond. We remain extremely concerned about indiscriminate attacks and the deliberate targeting of protected civilians, which contravenes international law. The indiscriminate aerial bombardments of civilian areas in particular must stop. Mr. President, the recent presidential elections of 3rd of June were not free or fair, and they directly contravene the roadmap outlined in the Geneva Communiqué. This called for a transitional governing body to be agreed by mutual consent. The United Kingdom remains extremely concerned about the humanitarian situation and the intentional denial of assistance to civilians. We call on all parties to facilitate the prompt delivery of humanitarian aid, and we thank the neighbouring countries for their support. Mr. President, we have consulted colleagues extensively on the text. The resolution that we present today is a balanced text reflecting a call on all parties to end violence, respect human rights and comply with international law. The resolution has 4 key aims. Firstly, to call for access to Syria by the Independent Commission of Inquiry. Secondly, to condemn in the strongest terms the ongoing violations of international humanitarian law and the violations and abuses of international human rights law from whatever quarter. Thirdly, to support current and future efforts on accountability, noting the potential role for the International Criminal Court. Fourthly, to highlight the deteriorating humanitarian situation. This has a direct impact on the human rights of civilians. Mr. President, the United Kingdom believes that this resolution represents a measured response to the worst human rights situation that this Council has faced. The resolution deserves the broadest support within the Council, and we hope it can be adopted by consensus. Otherwise, we let down the very people that this Council was created to protect. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. I recognize Saudi Arabia.
شكرا السيد الرئيس.
Thank you, President. My delegation wishes to submit this proposal on behalf of Kuwait, Jordan, the United States, Britain, Kuwait, Germany and Italy and Qatar and Turkey. We are meeting today after 3 years of suffering on the part of the Syrian people. Unfortunately, we are still in the tunnel. The Syrian people are still suffering as a result of this crisis. Given the suffering of the Syrian people, my country is deeply anxious because it turns out that the international community is incapable to do anything about the current regime in Syria, which is violating human rights. It is vital for this Council to take a radical decision against the Syrian government and its allies. We must make sure that a mechanism is set up to bring this Syrian regime to justice, in keeping with the terms of the draft resolution. This goes along with and reflects the scale of our friends, the Syrian people. It is important for the Council and for the international community to demonstrate and prove their unified position given these flagrant violations of human rights perpetrated by the Syrian regime. I therefore appeal to all member states to adopt this draft resolution by consensus. Because if this draft resolution were to be submitted to the vote, that would constitute just another opportunity for the Syrian regime to violate human rights, the human rights which this Council is supposed to uphold. Thank you, sir.
Monsieur l'ambassadeur, je vous remercie.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'm informed by the Secretariat that there are 11 additional co-sponsors. I now give the floor to member states that wish to make general comments on this draft. I recognize Italy. I see Italy, Brazil. Are there other requests? I recognize Italy.
I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union. The situation in the Syrian Arab Republic is increasingly deteriorating, and systematic and widespread violations and abuses of human rights law and violations of humanitarian law continue to be committed unabated. It is civilians who continue to suffer heavily on a daily basis. The EU remains gravely concerned with the continuing bloodshed and calls for the cessation of all violence to allow urgent and unhindered humanitarian access on the ground. We are also concerned about the spread of extremism and extremist groups. Their involvement in the conflict exacerbates the suffering of local communities and also poses a threat to regional and international security. We reaffirm that the Syrian authorities bear the responsibility to protect the civilian population, and they continue to fail to do so. We note that the Syrian regime in particular remains responsible for large-scale violations of human rights and international humanitarian law. The EU recalls that all responsible for such acts must be held accountable and that there can be no impunity for any such violations and abuses. The EU calls on the Security Council to urgently address the prevailing culture of impunity and refer to the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court. The EU strongly condemns all acts of violence directed against humanitarian actors. We continue to urge all parties to the conflict to fully respect their obligations under international humanitarian law and to implement in full and without further delay the provisions of Security Council Resolution 2139. To this end, we strongly support further urgent action by the UN Security Council to address the humanitarian situation in Syria. The resolution before us calls for an end to impunity, emphasizes the urgent need to accountability, and demands that the Syrian authorities cooperate fully with the Commission of Inquiry, including by granting it immediate, full and unfettered access throughout the Syrian Arab Republic. Mr. President, only an urgent political solution can end this terrible bloodshed. We call on all UN members to reaffirm their support to the resumption of the peace process based on the 2012 Geneva Communique. The EU condemns the violation of civil and political rights surrounding the presidential elections in Syria. The EU remains ready to provide all the support needed to achieve a political settlement, working with partners, particularly the United Nations, to preserve Syria's territorial integrity and its multi-ethnic and multi-religious character. The resolution before us has the support of the European Union, and we invite all members of the Human Rights Council to join consensus around it. Thank you, Mr. President.
Je vous remercie, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur.
Thank you, Ambassador. I recognize Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President. Brazil wishes to express its support for the draft resolution on the human rights situation in Syria. We regret, however, that the negotiation process of the draft resolution wasn't conducted with the transparency and inclusiveness that would have been desirable. We firmly believe that there is no military solution to the Syrian crisis. The continuing hostilities disproportionately affects the most vulnerable groups, which suffer grave and systematic violations of their human rights. The reduction and cessation of hostilities in Syria should be a matter of priority for the international community. Brazil opposes any attempt to strengthen the military capacity of the parties involved in the conflict. We further repudiate unilateral sanctions at the fringes of international law, which worsen the humanitarian situation in Syria. We also reject any act perpetrated by any party involved in the hostilities that violates international humanitarian law and human rights. It is important that this Council reinforce within its attributions the elements that can contribute in the medium and long terms to overcoming the crisis in Syria. Alleged human rights violations have been identified as triggering the current crisis in Syria. Reinforcing commitments for compliance with human rights should play a role in the efforts to ensure the end of the conflict. In this sense, it is crucial that the Syrian government resumes dialogue with all parties and in doing so maintains the unequivocal commitment to freedom of opinion and expression, peaceful association and assembly, as well as the rights of political participation and religious freedom, condemning all forms of incitement to intolerance and discrimination based upon religious, ethnic or political views and beliefs in order to protect the most vulnerable groups of civil society. Brazil wishes to highlight that the reference to the Caesar report reminds us all that this Council should be guided by documents perceived as credible and impartial in the eyes of the international community. Furthermore, Brazil would like to note that the reference made in the draft resolution concerning the recent elections held in Syria does not entirely reflect the Brazilian position. Brazil further reaffirms its expectation that the successful adoption of the measures designed to eliminate the Syrian chemical arsenal may contribute to a negotiated solution of the conflict and that the achievement of the legitimate aspirations of Syrian society can be achieved. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Ambassador. I recognize I have Argentina on the list. Are there other requests for the floor after Argentina? I will therefore close the list at this stage, and I give the floor to Argentina as the last speaker on my list.
Thank you very much, sir. The government of Argentina restates its major concern regarding the spiral of violence experienced in Syria, with an increase in the use of force against the civilian population and terrible loss of life. We reject acts of violence by all parties against unarmed civilians, and we repeat our condemnation of those acts. And we appeal to all parties in the conflict to respect international humanitarian law and call on the government to meet its duty to respect and protect its citizens' human rights. We reject the violations of human rights and international humanitarian law in Syria, and we support all acts to enhance accountability. Humanitarian aid is essential to alleviate the suffering of the Syrian people, and therefore we request that unrestricted access of such aid be permitted. We believe that the only way to resolve this crisis is through dialogue and democratic participation of all sectors in political and civilian life in Syria, without external interference of any kind. We repeat the appeal to the parties to meet and comply with the negotiations, and also national and international actors to help to create an enabling environment to bring an end to the situation in Syria, so that the parties in conflict can find a solution. And therefore we call for a cessation of delivery of all weapons and funding which simply compound the suffering of the Syrian people. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now hear from the country concerned by this draft resolution. And I therefore give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic. You have the floor. Thank you, sir. This council is meeting to examine a draft resolution which is neither objective nor professional. It is based on an entirely hypocrite and wrong approach. The mistake here is in putting a legitimate government on the same footing as a terrorist group which is causing destruction and death in my country and other countries. This is indicative of the negligence of the authors of the draft resolution vis-à-vis what is going on in Syria, and they're covering up the truth, and they're very far from finding a political resolution to this crisis. May I demonstrate this via a number of points? I would like to show how this resolution is not objective and it is politicized. Firstly, the draft resolution sets out allegations which have no basis against the Syrian Arab Republic. However, it omits to mention the armed terrorist groups who are committing monstrous crimes, and simply recalls that these groups should follow the principles of international law. And those who are pointing their arms against Syria are being treated in a civilized way, as if they were subjects of international law. How can this draft resolution expect that those who crucify children, who cut people's heads off and so on, how can these people probably be expected to understand the language of morality? Furthermore, this draft resolution states that hospitals are being used to military ends. Now, it is true that armed groups are indeed transforming these hospitals into a departure point for their criminal action. And those who are ignorant of this truth only need to check the facts with those United Nations staff who have met members of terrorist groups and armed groups at the Al Ayoun hospital in Aleppo. Thirdly, the draft resolution mentions the humanitarian matter and the question of chemical weapons in Syria. And this is linked with the question of international humanitarian law and law that applies during military operations. In fact, the sponsors of this resolution have already refused to allow this council to tackle this matter, which supposedly does not fall within its purview. The sponsors are insisting, including these points in the draft resolution today. In past work, the United Kingdom delegate said that the Human Rights Council does not have within its purview the discussion of matters of international law, and I would like to quote
and does not support efforts to take this body into this dimension. This council is not an arms control forum and does not have the expertise to venture into an area that should be addressed in those settings. انتهى الاقتباس. أما مندوب فرنسا فقال آنذاك وأقتبس.
Thank you. End of quotation. France. France has said that this does not fall within the purview of this council. So, is this contradiction the result of incorrect understanding of the situation, or are we faced with premeditated hypocrisy on the part of countries who ignore international law? And that, in fact, is more likely to be the case. Fourthly, the draft resolution talks about the most recent elections in Syria, and we're talking about flagrant interference in Syrian affairs. In fact, this goes against the objectives of the Council, which calls for the reinforcement of fundamental rights and human rights. This draft, however, fails to defend thousands of Syrians who are in Syria and outside, and ignores the situation of the Syrian people who previously enjoyed stability in their lives. The sponsors of this draft resolution, including Belgium, Germany, France, the United States, all claim to be defending democracy, but they are denying the Syrian people their right to vote. And what particularly strikes us is that the elections in Syria have not been were not approved by all the parties, but the Syrian people in fact had an opportunity to express their opinion, and this is something which is endorsed by international observers who are members of this council. Nobody can ignore that fact. It's important to understand that these elections constituted a significant step in moving towards an end to the Syrian crisis. This draft resolution, President, in a premeditated fashion, ignores the real situation and ignores the destiny of the Syrian people. Or one can simply say that it is making fun of the Syrian people. That would perhaps be a more accurate interpretation. In fact, this draft resolution is only here to serve the purposes of terrorism. It simply seeks to prolong the crisis, and there are many examples of this, but I personally here now do not have the time to go into all of them. Members of Council should turn to Turkey, a co-sponsor of this draft resolution, and appeal to Turkey to explain and justify the arsenal of Oyel and Daesh, because they were able to enter Syria and Iraq thanks to support from Turkey, which is serving the interests of other states and that simply wish to see the destruction of Syria. We've seen such violations of human rights throughout the world. We're talking about an approach which is typical of the United States and part of the history and historical approach of the United States, which claims to be defending freedoms but actually arms terrorists and extremists in terrorism, the aim of which is to achieve the disintegration of the countries of the region in order to serve the interests of Israel, which is endorsing these terrorists who are located in these hospitals, and United States is also endorsing the behavior of its little sibling, the United Kingdom, with a scandalous past in this regard. And France is also involved. Another main culprit in this crisis. The French foreign minister recognized in an interview in Le Monde that this was essentially what was happening. And what emerged was a picture of the stupidity of French policy, and this led to a large number of French citizens going as terrorists to Syria. Interruption by the President. May I ask you to conclude? You may have a couple of minutes more, but please come to a conclusion. Apologies, President. I am simply anxious to draw your attention to the fact that at previous sessions, in previous meetings on item 4, you have given a number of countries the opportunity to speak freely and to express their position vis-à-vis a draft resolution of a similar nature. I would just like to draw the attention to the fact that you gave the floor to the ambassador of Sri Lanka for 10 minutes in a previous meeting. So I appeal to you to show fairness and treat us all equally. You have 1 more minute to present your position. You have already used 6 minutes. You will understand that you're already going beyond the speaking time that was made available to you. My apologies, President. I would just like to say that you have given plenty of time to other countries to express their opinions, and I would ask you that you give me the appropriate time to do the same thing. Once again, I would like to indicate that the disaster, and so and interruption of the President. France would like to raise a point of order because my minister has been the object of slander on the part of the Syrian ambassador. We do not support Syria in Syria, and we are doing everything along with our partners to achieve a political resolution to this crisis, to which we wish to see end as quickly as possible. President, I thank France for this statement and the point of order raised. I would now like to invite the Syrian delegation to use appropriate language in Council that is appropriate to this august assembly. There's no point in using invective on other inappropriate language. Please use appropriate language. I give the floor to you for 1 further minute. President, I don't know how you can say that you're being supportive of me, but in response to the French point of order, he used much worse language vis-à-vis the president of my country, and I simply quoted from the interview in Le Monde, the newspaper dating back to 2012. Unfortunately, Saudi Arabia, as a member of this council, and Qatar too, have taken up their positions. President, there can be no resolution without prior consultations that takes account of the concerns of the country concerned in its sovereignty. And we do not see objectivity and honesty in this resolution. This is also true that the countries that have drafted this feel that they can buy the voices and consciences. We must make sure that this Council does not follow the same path of previous bodies. We therefore call upon all members of the Council to refuse this iniquitous resolution, which simply seeks to prolong terrorism and crisis. President, I have been informed that there are no PBI consequences attached to this resolution. I now give the floor to members of Council who wish to explain their vote before the vote takes place. I will now draw up a list. Algeria, Russian Federation, Cuba, China, Venezuela. Any other requests? I close the list. I recognize Algeria.
Merci.
Thank you. I would like to give the view of my delegation on this draft resolution and explain our decision. Given the absence of transparency and the lack of openness in consultations in the context of this draft resolution, as in the past, the sponsors of this draft resolution have continued to act behind closed doors. Secondly, we reject this draft resolution because there's a profound imbalance in the content. This imbalance is particularly clear in paragraph 5, 6, 11, 12, 13, 14 and 15 of the draft resolution. And lastly, in addition to the lack of transparency in consultations and the imbalance in the text, we do not agree with the content of paragraph 24 regarding the presidential elections. This reference is a regrettable precedent in that the Human Rights Council is not mandated and certainly not equipped to give an opinion on electoral processes of any type. For all these reasons, I repeat what I've already said. Algeria will vote against this draft resolution. Thank you. President, thank you, Mr. Ambassador, and I call on the Russian Federation.
President, today we're examining the latest tendentious draft resolution on Syria, which ignores the real situation in the country. Blame for the violence against people is laid exclusively on the governments of the country. The word of terrorism is mentioned in passing just once. And this in a situation with monstrous evils of the jihadists, which the Independent Commission of Inquiry has deemed to be war crimes, threaten to destabilize the situation in the region for years and to drive the situation of human rights into total decline. Terrorist groups such as the ISIS, the Jabhat al-Nusra and the Islamic Front are not even mentioned, although they are included in the UN Security Council's terrorist list and in the lists of a number of states. And this, in addition, is happening against the background of attempts to undermine the Iraqi state by ISIS. The mention of the made-to-order report acting as anti-Syria strategy and the so-called Caesar report is completely unacceptable and unconvincing. In a context of a political process, what we see mentioned is a transitional government body that deprives the Syrians of any motivation to agree on the whole series of matters of settlement. There's criticism of the elections that were held in keeping with the constitution in the country. The last consignment of chemical weapons just left the country, but this, nevertheless, we see an inept appeal to the government to complete their program of disarmament. We have suggested amendments that would actually allow us to reflect the reality. The vast majority of them in keeping with the Commission of Inquiry's findings. The co-sponsors, however, have refused to take into account these constructive suggestions. Not one single such resolution has actually helped put an end to violence in Syria. They are all one-sided and biased initiatives, and they have simply served the geopolitical interests at the moment of a narrow group of states, which initially was hypocritically called the Group of Friends of Syria, and then subsequently changed its name, became the core group of Friends of Syria. And this is because only 11 of the original 107 members of this group were continued to support this approach to the coercive overthrow of the legitimate government of Syria. Now, when it comes to Syrian policy here in the Human Rights Council, there are two approaches. Firstly, the direct promotion of such anti-Syrian resolutions which split the international community and do not cause an improvement in the human rights situation in Syria, whereas the second is the pursuit of the interests of the Syrian people, rising above political divergences and coming up with a united agenda which will relieve the sufferings of Syrian people. This is Russia's position when it initiated a human rights statement on local pacification in Syria. Unfortunately, a number of countries not only did not support this statement, but also did not abstain from public opposition to the measures that were designed to save lives and to bring about the most important strategic job, which is the organisation of a concerted struggle on the part of the government and moderate opposition against terrorism, which is a threat to the entire Middle East and indeed the whole world. This initiative has not even been reflected in the current draft resolution, in which context we request a vote on this draft. We will be voting against, and we call upon members of the Human Rights Council to vote with Russia against this draft. Thank you.
Je vous remercie.
Thank you. I call now on Cuba. Thank you very much, Mr. President. We restate our condemnation of the death of innocent civilians in any circumstances. Cuba rejects that a selective and manipulating attribution be laid for responsibility. One party in this conflict. Foreign intervention and warlike adventures simply cause a greater death toll. The role of the international community is to provide assistance, to protect peace and stability in this country, and not cause actions that cause deaths, aggressions of innocents, and citizen insecurity. The principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and non-interference in domestic affairs of states should be defended and be respected at all costs. Cuba restates its support for the quest for a peaceful and negotiated solution to the current crisis, and repeats its confidence in the ability of the people and government of Syria to resolve their problems internally without foreign interference, on the basis of full respect of their sovereignty and self-determination. Mr. President, for these reasons, Cuba will vote against the draft resolution submitted today. Thank you.
Je vous remercie, Madame.
Thank you, Madam. I call now on China.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, China has been very much concerned about the situation in humanitarian situation and human rights situation in Syria, which is getting worse. We feel compassionate with the Syrian people about their sufferings. We are strongly against and condemn the actions that are violation of human rights and a violation of the international law by any parties involved in the conflict. China has always been advocating that we should stick to a political solution of the Syrian issue. At present, what is urgent is that all parties involved in Syria should come to a ceasefire and stop all kinds of violence as early as possible, and to launch an inclusive political solution so as to achieve a political transition in this country. The international community should provide constructive support to this by helping an early launching of the Geneva negotiation involving all parties concerned in Syria. The Human Rights Council should have an impartial and balanced attitude when it comes to the discussion of the issue of Syria, vis-à-vis all parties involved in the country, which should be helpful to the ease up of the Syrian situation and help finding a political solution process of this issue. Regrettably, the drafted resolution L4 Rev 1 and its contents are not consistent with what we have said above. They're not helpful to a political solution of the Syrian issue. Therefore, the Chinese delegation will vote against this drafted resolution. I would like to take this opportunity to reaffirm that China is dedicated to the maintenance of sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of Syria. China has always have held an objective and impartial position on the Syrian issue without any self-interest involved, even less to cover up any parties or persons in Syria. Any political solution in the interest of the Syrian people and accepted by all parties in Syria will have our respect and support. China is willing to continue to work with the international community to actively contribute to a comprehensive, lasting and appropriate solution of the Syrian issue in an early date. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I call on Venezuela. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Most energetically and repeatedly, we have rejected in different multilateral fora, and in particular within the context of this Council, we have rejected the politicization and double standards clear in initiatives like this one. This is an undesirable, illegitimate practice that provides no benefits for the victims of violations of human rights. We have here a totally unbalanced text that fails to take into account the real situation being experienced in the country. We reject this systematic policy of interference and destabilization in Syria. There are efforts to condemn the government of Syria, invoking human rights, but ignoring the continued proven violations of human rights committed by terrorist groups supported and armed from abroad. We are of the view that we should have a positive reaction to the recent presidential elections that took place in a transparent and democratic atmosphere consistent with the Constitution, and after which President Bashar al-Assad was victorious, reaffirming his leadership of the legitimate government of Syria. We repeat that the community of nations must respect the sovereignty and will of the Syrian people, as expressed in their massive turnout for the elections. Mr. President, we restate our support for initiatives intended to achieve a political, negotiated and peaceful outcome among the Syrians that will allow the countries to arrive at the lasting peace required by the people. For these reasons, Venezuela will vote against L4 Rev 1. Thank you.
Je vous remercie.
Thank you. I have no further requests. Are there any further requests? I see none. I didn't perhaps follow. I would ask the Russian Federation whether they were requesting a vote in their statement.
Yes, President, we are requesting a vote on this draft resolution. Thank you.
Je vous remercie.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, at the request of the delegation of the Russian Federation, we will now have a recorded vote on draft resolution A/HRC/26/L4/Rev 1 as orally revised. I would ask the Secretariat to open the voting machine, and I would ask members to vote.
Toutes les délégations ont-elles enregistré leur vote?
Have all delegations voted?
Veuillez vérifier que...
Please confirm that the correct vote is recorded on the screen. If so, I will ask the Secretariat to close down the machine. The vote has ended.
Alors, les résultats.
The results of the recorded vote on this draft resolution are as follows. Yes, 32. No, 5. Abstention, 9. The draft resolution A/HRC/26/L4/Rev 1 as orally revised is adopted.
copie des résultats du vote.
Copies of the outcome of the vote will be circulated